Yeah, I have it on a flash drive, so that shouldn't be too. Okay. I'm in the first group, so should I do it now? Okay. And then where should I sit? Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning. Good morning. Hi. It's so great to see such a good audience here at this bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And there's coffee outside if you didn't see, and a lot of good Danishes too. I had some of the coffee. It's pretty good. We're going to start right now. And Samantha, if you would tell people out in the hall that we're starting. We started planning this event really almost a year ago because we had to reach out to some of these speakers and get it on their calendar, and it's very great that they were able to do this. And our first speaker, we're going to have two panels on climate communications this morning, then have lunch. And anybody who hasn't registered yet, you can go out during the break between this panel and the next one and register at that time. To welcome you all this morning, the first two panels I said are going to be on climate communication, and to welcome you all here, and then I'm going to call up the panelists for the first panel, is Ann Chester. Ann is the director of a great program here at WVU, run out of the School of Medicine, called HISTA, the Health Sciences and Technology Academy. And over a decade, I'd say, or maybe more than that, they have done sort of science enrichment education in West Virginia schools, but they combine it with a wonderful program of scholarship assistance for students who go on, and Ann will tell you something about it. Obviously, a science literate population is really helpful to making progress on climate change. And I've had the great honor of doing science education programs, hands-on stuff in front of their HISTA clubs in schools around West Virginia for the last couple of years. It's been probably one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. Please make welcome Ann Chester.
Good morning, everybody. It is wonderful to see you here. Welcome to the National Energy Conference 2018, and the topic today is climate issues. This is the most important topic that I can think of. This is the topic that impacts our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and if there's a person in this room who's not concerned about their kids, I don't know them. This is a time that is really important to put all of our energies towards figuring out how to use our assets to make a difference in the future. You and I were born into the Anthropocene, however you want to speak about this. The Anthropocene is when humans, Homo sapiens, are having the biggest impact on our planet in the history of the planet. No one species has ever impacted the globe like we are now. It is one of our gifts as a species, gifts in quotes, But another one of our gifts, this is something that is peculiar only to Homo sapiens as we know it, is the ability to create governments, religions, movements, organizations, cooperations. This is our gift. This is a chance to use our gift because we are going to have to adapt, create, adopt new strategies. We're going to need to organize across diversities of people, diversities of countries, diversity of ages, diversities of interests. I know right now is not necessarily a time when we think we're very good at it, but really in actuality we are, as a species, really good at this. So for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, we'd better bring this skill to the forefront and put away the me attitude. That's an attitude that genetically we're wired to have. But we need to override our circuitry, our genetic circuitry, and develop another habit we also have, another genetic circuitry wiring, the we attitude. The we attitude so that we can look at ourselves in relationship to the entire globe and to look at ourselves in relationship to not only the people that we love directly, but the people around the globe, and not just people, but animals and plants and the rest of it. We are not alone on this planet. We cannot exist alone on this planet. And the me attitude has got us thinking that we're doing a pretty good job, and in actuality, Tom can tell you it's not as good as we would hope for our kids. So I want to challenge everybody in this room today to pull out the genetic circuitry of the we attitude and figure out how to collaborate. We all come with different skills. We all come with different passions. We all come with different beliefs, and we all come with different willingnesses, and we can bring this diversity together. And West Virginia is a perfect place to do it. I mean, we've got a history of being leaders. The first thing we can do is to figure out how to work together so that we can figure out how to adapt, how to change, how to create infrastructure so that the future is more guaranteed for our great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. And I want to tell you why I'm passionate about it. Well, first of all, probably not even Tom knows this, but I was studying climate change back in 1977, 78, 79 in the Arctic. Yeah, I did my research in Alaska, in the Tussock Tundra, and I traveled up and down the pipeline looking at the impact of climate change. So I doubt if he even knows that. So I have a passion that comes from 30 plus years. But my passion is also in the understanding that kids are our vectors of change. And through kids, if we can get our kids to understand and to help and to adapt and to create, that our chances of success are even higher. So as a part of this, I have developed with a lot of help this program that Tom was talking about, the Health Sciences and Technology Academy. It was born in 1994. And so in West Virginia is the only place that this exists. The purpose for this is to get kids who are often overlooked, kids who come from backgrounds who don't think they're ever going to college, don't think they have a chance to get into college. Capture them in the 9th grade. Capture them in the 9th grade and show them what it takes to be successful, to be a part of a family, to be a part of a movement, and to go to college and to go back into West Virginia as STEM professionals to live and work. So since 1994, we are very happy to say that we have graduated over 2,700 of these kids, kids from foster homes, from homes whose families have never gone to college, from African American and other minority groups that you don't see in college as much as we should. Kids from the first in their family, from the poorest of the poor, 800 at a time. We take them in the 9th grade only and then grow them up through the 12th grade. And at the end, if they have done research every single year, immerse themselves in fixing community problems from which they grow up in, And then they do that 4 years and come to 2 different college summer camps. At the end of that, they get a tuition waiver. Thank you. And this comes from the West Virginia legislature. This happened because of collaboration across the aisles. It was voted 100% back in 1997 to give these kids a tuition waiver, not only in the undergraduate years, but all the way through medical school, dental school, pharmacy school, nursing, and STEM PhDs. And this happens not just at WVU, but at Marshall, all across, and Concord, and Glenville, and State, and so all the public institutions provide this tuition waiver. The outcome of this has been that 62% of them end up in STEM careers. Well, first of all, 99% go to college. 99% go to college. And 91% graduate with a degree. Now, that is unheard of. The 4-year degrees, 87% of them, and if you look, 87% graduating with a 4-year degree in West Virginia is like twice what happens to the normal everyday population. So we have broken the sound barrier by paying attention to these kids at the 9th grade and growing their ability to make a difference in their communities, to become STEM literate, and to love their community, because now it matters to them. They see they can make a difference. That mattering. And they are now concerned about climate change as well, more concerned, because they have an understanding that they are a part of the problem. So with this in mind, that we have this massive organization, I want to put this out here for you as a challenge. Are there ways that you can collaborate with the Health Sciences and Technology Academy? And if not the Health Sciences and Technology Academy, then some other organization in this room to generate a bigger forward motion to make a difference in our future for our great-great-grandchildren. I want to tell you the impact on the HISTA kids from just one collaboration with Tom over the last 2 years. He's had, well, I think it was last year, Tom, wasn't it, that you had over 200 kids at a time through your 400. Okay, so 400 kids. And these are kids that I described the background they come from. Climate change is not the first thing on their mind. Mostly it's, where am I going to get clothes? How am I going to find my next food for my next meal? Am I going to have a shelter over my head? I mean, this is serious stuff. But in the midst of all this, they're learning how to navigate that. They're also learning how to navigate much, much greater things, and that is the freedom that higher education will give them if they can get through this. So at the end of the day, with his 400 kids, Tom asked them, what is the most important thing that you learned in this program? One kid said, that climate change exists. Another kid said, how global warming works. Another one said, humans are the biggest cause of global warming. Another one says, we need to change or climate change can be dangerous. Another one says, we've changed the atmosphere in 100 years from its steady trend of 100,000 years. Another one said, 2017 is a little worrisome. Another one summed it up by saying, you need to know about the world to know where you stand in life. These are just a few of the comments. But the power of collaboration gives us a chance to make a difference. So I want to offer hope if we can figure out how to collaborate, and I want to challenge us to collaborate for the hope of our great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. Thank you.
You guys are our first 3 panelists. You want to come up and have a seat? Sure. All right. Just a word about the climate change communication. When we were talking about, we'd done a couple of programs in the past about the impacts of climate change, especially in the Highlands, where Friends of Blackwater, which is the organization that I'm a board member of, and that my wife Judy runs, worried about the impacts of climate change in the Allegheny Highlands, losing such things as native brook trout. They're on the chopping block. Current trends, forget it. No more. This is the state fish of West Virginia, for goodness sake. And that's true of so many species in the Highlands, and it's true of so many aspects of our economy here. Not to mention the ski industry, things like that. Really kind of grim prospects for the future if we don't rein in climate change. And then we did one program here, very interesting program, year or two ago on where we looked at carbon capture and what was being done here at WVU, and a lot of people have been working on that. And then we did another, so we thought we'd do one more conference, those having been kind of nice. And climate communication is something that I think that it is so important. And if you look at what Ann was referring to, some of the real heroes on the climate change front in West Virginia are science teachers. And they're the people who run her HISTA clubs like that, because that's their job, is to tell the truth. They can't avoid it. They have to tell the scientific truth, and that's challenging in West Virginia for political reasons. And nevertheless, they very courageously do that job every day, and they've been great sponsors of educational programs so that teachers learn more about the science. So communicating about climate change, it seems to be, whenever you look around at the issue, seems to be really a crucial aspect of it. Not just what's the science and what are the technologies that can fix it, but how do you build the social consensus and the cultural and political support for it in a communication fashion. And of course that involves climate, so many disciplines, and we got three disciplines here, or two disciplines and one practical person in this first round, and then the second round we're going to have three science teachers who are going to talk about climate communication specifically in that context. The first one is Dylan Selterman, who is a professor of psychology. And obviously, if you're going to communicate with human beings, you have to understand how human beings operate. And he has applied his research in the area of game theory and how people calculate risks and that ilk to the area of climate change. And wrote a great article in the National Geographic recently that combined that, and he's going to talk about that. Second speaker is Josh, what's your last name again? Murphy, I thought so. I was going to be embarrassed. He is a graduate student, just about a PhD, going to be a professor 5 more months. At the George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication, where there are a bunch of people studying all different kinds of, and he's going to try to give us an overview of the whole field of climate change communication. The third speaker is Rafe Pomerance. He's was recently featured on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. Did you bring your copy, Rafe? Rafe, that doesn't look like you. Show us a bit.
I have learned to be a self-promoter.
Yeah. Well, if you make the cover story of the New York Times Magazine, you are allowed to promote it a little bit, I think. And but he was one of the people involved in first bringing climate change to the American consciousness, and he's got a nice farm down in Germany Valley, and that's where we got to know Rafe, friendship with his West Virginia connections, boater. So he's going to give the closing remarks today at the end of the conference. But this morning, one of our speakers wasn't able to come, and so we asked Rafe if he would talk about, what he's learned about climate change communication in 40-plus years of doing that kind of work all over the world. He's now the chair of Arctic 21, which is an organization that communicates to the public about the risks of climate change to the Arctic. So we'll start out with Dylan. Come on up, and I'll move out of the way. Have a seat. I'll sit down here at the end. And they're gonna go 15 minutes each, or at the most, and no, because really, the opportunity to engage with folks from the audience is just as important as what they're going to say in their talks.
All right, hi everyone. So I'm from the University of Maryland, and as Tom said, I work in the psychology department, and I'm very excited to be here and talk to you about the psychology of climate change. So my story begins in the summer of 2015 when I was working at my desk and all of a sudden started getting phone calls and emails from NPR and the Baltimore Sun and Fox News and the Washington Post and BuzzFeed and local radio stations, and they were all asking about this extra credit question that I was giving to my class. And I'm not going to lie, my first thought was, uh-oh, what did I do and what did my students do? Because I'm not the type of person who loves all of that attention. So what were they doing? They were tweeting. This tweet by one of my students was liked and retweeted over 10,000 times in a matter of days. And as I started to, talk with more people in the media about this exercise, I got really excited because people were talking about psychology and they were talking about game theory. And I knew that this was a teachable moment. I knew that I had an opportunity to educate people about the tragedy of the commons and about the prisoner's dilemma, and that this was a way to help people conceptualize group decision-making and environmental concerns. People saw this not only as an exercise in social behavior, but morality and ethics as well, that their personal choices could affect the lives of others around them. So let's talk a little bit about the exercise first. And full disclosure, I did not create this exercise. This exercise was being used for decades before I came on the scene. It was invented in the early 90s, and my professor in college, Steve Broaddus, was the one who did it with my class, and that's how I learned about it. But essentially, students are given the opportunity to choose 2 or 6 points of extra credit that goes on their term paper grade. So they are free to choose whichever they like, but there's a catch. If more than 10% choose 6 points, then nobody gets any points. So there's an upper limit on the amount of overconsumption of the points in the exercise. So, and by the time this got famous, from 2008 to 2015, I had taught dozens of classes over that time, and only one class actually got the points. And that class actually hit 10 right on the nose. They were just on the threshold. And all of the other classes I taught had failed the exercise. They all went over the 10% threshold. Now, it's worth noting, and I'll talk about this a little bit in a couple of minutes here, but most students, usually around 80%, choose 2 points. So the idea that this exercise reveals that we're all selfish, I think, is incorrect. Most people are trying to make the communal choice. And then after the exercise, my students and I discuss Garrett Hardin's influential essay on the tragedy of the commons, and about the dilemma we face about our individual growth and well-being versus societal stability. Garrett Hardin's influential essay was written 50 years ago, and he outlined this inherent dilemma we face as we try to maximize our individual benefit while at the same time trying to account for everyone's collective well-being. The points in the exercise are analogous to grazing pasture, as Hardin described, or water or land or oil or any other resource. And if we're thinking inversely about pollution, it's the amount of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases that we're emitting. And if a few people are over-consuming, that's not necessarily a problem. But if too many people are thinking this way, and if all we're thinking about is maximizing our own benefits, that could be a big problem. If too many of us consider only what's good for ourselves, then we end up with overconsumption. This is how we end up with overharvesting, water shortages, or, as we're here to talk about today, climate change. So now the next logical question is, okay, well, how do we fix this? How do we solve this problem and reduce the amount of overconsumption? And this is where psychology does offer some answers and solutions. As I'm sure many of you are aware, we look up to those that we admire, our role models, our parents, our teachers, celebrities. And positive role models can promote good behavior. We can also reward or punish people. We can give incentives or fine people for overconsumption. This is straight out of behaviorism. California now fines people for using too much water. We can incentivize green behaviors like solar panels or hybrid cars. And of course, don't underestimate the power of social norms. And as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, most people are choosing 2 points. So this is a normative behavior. And simply the awareness or the activation of social norms can shift people's behavior because we're very, very social and we want to fit in. Research has shown that if you look at people's behavior, let's say whether they reuse their towels in hotel rooms, if you have the standard pro-environmental message, this is good for the planet, that's not going to work nearly as well as saying most of the other people who stay in this hotel reuse their towels. So maybe you'd want to fit in with everybody else. And on your utility bill, if you get your energy usage and right next to it is the mean or the average for your community, if your score is a little bit higher, you're going to bring your consumption down because you want to fit in with the community, the rest of the group. So social norms can be very powerful. Now, Garrett Hardin suggested in his essay that educating people about the tragedy of the commons can help solve the problem. And I'm going to come out with a hot take. I don't think that that's true. I don't think that knowledge is necessarily going to fix the problem because throwing facts in people's faces doesn't necessarily change their minds. It's worth noting that after this exercise got very famous, some of my colleagues told me, oh, that's too bad, you're not going to be able to use this exercise anymore because now the students will know about it and they'll all get the points. No. They continued, I used this exercise for another year after it got famous, and students continued to fail. They did not stay under the 10% threshold, even though they knew about the exercise. Now, why is that? Well, again, we have an idea from psychology, that is, we do lots of motivated reasoning. When our intellect is strengthened, then we use our reasoning capabilities in order to confirm, not change, our beliefs. And I want to bring in some data from Dan Kahan, who's at Yale and studies cultural cognition and has done some research specifically on people's attitudes toward climate change, asking, for example, is there solid evidence of recent global warming due to mostly human activities? And this graph, I think, shows all of what you need to know here. So on the left, you see how ordinary science intelligence or knowledge, the type of thing that you can measure with standardized testing, predicts polarization. So on the left here, you see, people with low science knowledge, they're not really sure whether there's evidence for global warming. But then as you move to the right of this graph, liberals and Democrats are very convinced that it's happening, whereas conservative Republicans are saying, no, it's not. So the evidence here is that knowledge and intelligence predicts polarization. But what about some other variable that might help us? We do have evidence that curiosity predicts convergence, attitude convergence among liberals and conservatives as a function of curiosity. And this is not something that you can do with standardized testing. This is measured by, say, looking at how much time people spend watching documentaries about science or reading science magazines. Their genuine intrinsic interest in the topic is what predicts their attitude convergence on climate change. And the good thing is that curiosity is something that we're born with. We have it from the minute we're entering into this world. So what we need to do is just capitalize on people's natural instincts to explore. So my first take-home point for this talk today is don't try to change people's minds. Instead, try to capitalize on their existing values, the things that they genuinely care about, because that's going to offer a much better solution here. And I want to segue to talk a little bit about another big theory in psychology that I've been working on for the past few years, and that's moral foundations theory. Moral foundations theory suggests that people have a diversity of moral concerns, among them care, fairness, and liberty, which on average happen to be more prominently held by liberals, and others including loyalty, respect, and purity, which on average happen to be held more prominently by conservatives. Care is about protection from harm. Fairness is about equality. Liberty is about individual freedom. Loyalty is about patriotism and allegiance. Respect is about deference to authority figures and institutions. And purity is about spirituality, the idea your body is a temple, avoiding things that are disgusting or degrading. Moral foundations theory suggests that people can have different moral pathways, but often they might lead to the same conclusions. So think about this, from the perspective of liberals. If you're concerned about equality in thinking about the tragedy of the commons, it would be logical to consider what you would want others to do and then act accordingly. Put another way, the golden rule. If you want others to conserve, you should conserve. Conservatives, more concerned maybe about with the strength of our community and our nation. So in thinking about the tragedy of the commons, it would be logical to consider what would be best for society as a whole to keep everything intact. Or put another way, e pluribus unum, and the idea that conservation is patriotic. That is, we're doing what's best for the country. Green is the new red, white, and blue. Case in point would be the Pentagon, usually in charge of the military stuff. They're now considering climate change and national security threats. So building on this, I want to reference some work by Matt Feinberg and Rob Willer, who studied people's attitudes toward environmental behaviors using stories. And they gave people, in this experiment, a story, and participants were randomly assigned to be told in the story that the protagonist, the main character, either recycled or did not recycle, or in the control condition, they didn't get any information about recycling. And for conservatives, who are pictured here on the right, these three bars, when they were asked to rate the morality of this character, it didn't really matter whether the character recycled or not. This was not for them a moral issue. For liberals, it was. When they were told that the character recycled, they liked this person a lot more in terms of, the moral rating. And when the person didn't recycle, they rated the character as significantly less moral. Now, this shows that liberals moralize recycling behavior and environmental behaviors more generally. Why might that be? Well, according to some other research by these folks, they found that pro-environmental messages are often framed in terms of the moral foundation that liberals care a little bit more about. Messages like help protect the environment and save the environment. This is very harm and care-centered language. So the researchers thought, well, okay, what if we reframe the message to be consistent with something conservatives care more about? So they reframed the message to focus on purity and sanctity. They used messaging like, pollution is gross and disgusting. We need to clean up the planet. And they found that when they used the purity-sanctity framing, the difference between liberals and conservatives went away. It vanished completely, statistically speaking. So we have some evidence that moral foundations, theory suggests you can have different pathways to the same conclusion, but you have to reach people based on things they already care about. Now, I want to come full circle here and go back to the class exercise, the one that went viral. I mentioned how, despite the fame of the exercise, students still weren't getting the points, but I wasn't satisfied with that. I wanted to see whether I could nudge my students to change. I wanted to see if they would be willing to sacrifice the points for their grade that they love so much. So in 2016, I introduced a third option. So in addition to the original 2, students can choose either 2 points, 6 points, or 0 points. Now, why would students choose 0 points? Because now, either way, they're not going to get anything. But for every student who chooses 0, one of the 6-point choosers chosen at random will lose all their points. So the 6-point chooser chosen at random will have all their points taken away, and that person will be subtracted from the total. So by choosing 0, this is taken from Ernest Fair and Simon Gaertner's idea of altruistic punishment. And by the way, I don't necessarily love that terminology because there's some debate about whether altruism is really a thing. But the behavior is clear. It's a self-sacrificing behavior in order to reduce overconsumption behavior in the context of the group. So since implementing this third option, before I mentioned virtually none of the classes got the points, now about half of them do. So we went to about 1 out of every 2 classes that I teach now gets the points. I'll show you the data from just this past semester. I did this exercise with my fall 2008 social psychology class. 119 students in this section, 104 chose 2 points, 11 chose 6, and 4 chose 0, for an effective rate of 5.83% overconsumption, well below the 10% threshold. So to me, this is a remarkable turnaround. And just this semester, for the first time, I tried another twist on top of the twist I just mentioned, where I invited some students who ended up with positive points to donate one of their points to the 0-point choosers. And 3 of my students came up after class and said, yeah, I'd like to donate one of my points to those who chose 0. So we seem to be naturally inclined toward more pro-social behavior when this extra element is introduced, and we like rewarding those who sacrifice for the benefit of the collective. So in conclusion, my second take-home point is that action by a few people can make a significant difference. A few students can help an entire class of hundreds gain a leg up in the course. A few people who recycle or compost can have a contagious effect on others' lifestyles. A few politicians' votes can alter national and international policies that affect millions and billions. I'm excited and inspired to see Congress this week introduce the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which I know some others in this group are going to talk about. I know Jim's going to talk about it from CCL later today. And this was introduced by a bipartisan group of Democrats and Republicans. If passed, it would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% in 10 years and 90% by 2050. That's a bigger cut than even President Obama's Clean Power Plan or the United States' commitment under the Paris Climate Agreement. So we can make change and keep some healthy optimism. And remember these wise words from the Beatles. All the world is birthday cake, so take a piece, but not too much. Thank you.
We'll hold the questions until all 3 have done their presentation.
Hey everyone, good morning. My name is Josh Murphy. I'm, as our host said earlier today, I'm a ABD PhD candidate at George Mason University, and I work studying broadcasters, climate journalists, and regular journalists who are interested in climate change through my work at 4C. And kind of how I came to this topic, I worked as a radio broadcaster for a couple of years before I got into kind of the academic pursuit, and I never really lost kind of that respect / kind of itch to be in the media, and so I really enjoy kind of the work that we're doing. So today what I'm going to do, give you guys an overview of the Center for Climate Change Communication, what we've been doing for the past 11 years that we've been open. I'm going to talk about the Climate Matters in the Newsroom project, and then I'm also going to, if we have time, briefly touch on some of the work that I'm specifically doing with barriers to climate journalism. So let's see here. Just to kind of get in with our mission statement, our mission at 4C, Center for Climate Change Development is the acronym, our mission is to develop and apply social science insights to help society make informed decisions that will stabilize Earth's climate and prevent further harm that's due to climate change. In order to achieve this goal, we engage in 3 different broad activities at our center. One, we conduct unbiased communication research around climate change topics. 2, we help government agencies, civic organizations, professional associations, and other companies apply social science research in order to improve public engagement initiatives. And then our third kind of thing that we do is that we train students and professionals with the knowledge and skills necessary to improve public engagement on climate change. So I'm going to briefly go over some of our programs. The first program that we launched, kind of the second year that we were open, was Climate Change in the American Mind. Some people may have heard of it. I talked to some people last night at the dinner about it. And it was one of our earliest programs established at the center. I was in a partnership with the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication, where we conduct nationally representative surveys twice a year in most years in order to explore and track a generalized public understanding of climate change. And then we can compare those surveys kind of year in and year out. Another project that we do is a Climate Matters, and it's basically where we take TV weathercasters and try to teach them how to be climate educators. So that launched in 2009. Another one is Climate and Health. And Climate and Health, it's a collaboration. We launched that in 2014. It's a collaboration with leading medical and nursing societies and other organizations. And we essentially assess clinicians' knowledge of and experiences with climate change and health and how climate change can impact health. And we also try to use that data to educate the public and policymakers about ongoing negative effects of climate change, as well as some of the health benefits for solving the issue. More of our programs that we work with, there we go. Republican, that launched in 2012 under the leadership of a 6-term Republican congressman from South Carolina. I believe it was the 4th district, Bob Ingalls. It started as, it was known as the Energy and Enterprise Initiative, but it later became known as Republican. And it's been working to bring political conservatives back into the conversation about climate change by facilitating climate change dialogues that are centered around free market. I think that's a really interesting project. I haven't worked too much with that one, but I've met a lot of people with it, and it's a really cool program. I think you should check it out. Since 2012, we've also been working in a partnership with the National Park Service and the Urban Ecology Research Alliance, where we've been hosting climate change communications internships. And we've placed over 24 interns, I believe, in the national parks, and they work closely along park staff in order to develop educational resources for students and programs that teach about the impacts of climate change. And finally, climate resilience in the mid-Atlantic. Since 2012, when we launched that, we've been in partnership with a myriad of government agencies, civic organizations, and universities throughout the Northern Virginia, D.C. region. And we conduct and provide communication research and resources to all those organizations so that we can strengthen their own programs that exist about addressing climate issues. So briefly, I'm going to talk about some of our latest reports that have come out this year. The first one is, do millennials see climate change as more than just a meme? And the paper compares the climate change public opinions of millennials, people born between 1981 and 2000, to those of older generations. And kind of what we found through this report was that millennials have similar or even less engagement on global warming than other generations, and millennials are less likely to discuss global warming with their friends and families compared to older Americans. And they're also just as likely to believe that global warming is happening, and they're also just as likely to believe that it's personally important to them. They're just not having these same conversations for whatever reason. So another report that came out was Politics and Global Warming. And in that, we found that a majority of registered voters, 63%, are actually worried about global warming, and this includes 88% of liberal Democrats, 76% of moderate conservative Democrats, 58% of moderate Republicans, and about 30% of conservative Republicans. And and that has jumped to the moderate Republicans. It jumped 15% in the last year. So we thought that was kind of encouraging. And I'm going to talk about some of these ones a little bit later because they're part of some of the work that I've done. But we've also surveyed 4 different professional journalism societies in the last year: the Society of Environmental Journalists, the Radio, Television, Digital News Association, the National Association of Black Journalists, and the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. We've also published a new Climate Change in the American Mind survey this year, and we also published a report about the March of Science that occurred last year, where we interviewed several of the people that were in the march and then people that were following it and sharing it and supporting it using digital social media platforms. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about my work with the Climate Matters in the Newsroom project. So I've been a part of the Climate Matters in the Newsroom team since I was first hired to work at the center about 5 semesters ago. And with this specific project, it's an expansion of the standard Climate Matters program, but the Climate Matters program was just meant for weathercasters and to help meteorologists become climate educators. And that program, we had a lot of success with that. I believe we have over 500 weathercasters nationwide that are currently receiving our materials, but we wanted to broaden those trainings and those materials to not only apply to weathercasters, but to apply to any journalists from a wide variety of beats, backgrounds, mediums, kind of things like that. So we wanted to essentially help these journalists be able to tell timely, science-based stories and kind of treat climate change as a local issue, because a lot of what we found in our work is that people tend to care about the material more when it's presented as a local issue. So let's see. And data was collected. Yeah, it is kind of warm in here, but I didn't want to. Several people are saying it's a little hot in this room. I don't know if we can. The climate's warming. It's changing since we've all came in here. We need to do something about it. Yeah, 88% think it's bad. 57% think it's kind of bad. 30% aren't laughing. So it looks like we have somebody on that. So I'll go ahead and keep going just for the sake of time. So we used 3 different data collect. I'm assuming somebody's on it. Somebody's looking at great. So we used 3 different data collection methods, and we partnered with multiple professional journalism societies, like I said before. We conducted interviews in the fall 2017 with roughly 50 journalists to get an idea, kind of have them tell their story, what the barriers they were running into, challenges they faced, kind of the resources they wanted, and we used that to design a survey. And the survey went to just under 2,000 journalists, completed the entire thing, and we found out a lot of really interesting things about them. We found out a lot about the members' views about the role of a journalist in climate change and their impacts. We learned about journalists' overall understanding of climate change, and which journalists had a really strong understanding, which ones didn't, and kind of what informed that. We learned what their individual kind of perspectives and experiences are with climate change reporting, learned about the obstacles to reporting on climate change, and their practices of whether or not they present opposite viewpoints as kind of a journalistic norm. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our partner societies before I get into kind of what they responded with. So the first society was the Society of Environmental Journalists. These are largely freelance journalists. So I think about 1/3 or 2/3 of them worked as freelancers at the time of the survey. And these are people who essentially find their own leads. They write their own stuff. They'll either kind of contract out through a major kind of broadcasting entity, or they'll just self-publish. But they're the ones that typically have the most training, and they're already coming from some sort of environmental science background, and we noticed that they had very interesting and kind of unique perspectives on this. We also had the National Association of Black Journalists, like I said earlier, a National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and RTDNA. RTDNA, the Radio, Television, Digital News Association, that's an association mainly of news managers, news directors, kind of people that are behind the scenes and aren't necessarily engaging with stories day in and day out. And it was very interesting to see how much of a different kind of take that they had on a lot of these issues and how they perceived a lot of the problems differently than the journalists who kind of were the boots on the ground. So before I get into what they said, I want to cover one last thing. We broke our participants down into 6 different groups, essentially based on what their role was in the media. So the managers, they have a heavy influence on the overall culture of the workplace. They decide kind of the broad level direction. They handle hiring. They sometimes will handle promotions, where the funding goes, what stories will be covered, what ones won't be covered on a broad level. And kind of extension of managers or news directors, you can think of them as like the manager that's actually in the newsroom. They're the ones that are ensuring that the will of the general managers and broader managers are being carried out. We also have general reporters. Those are the people you kind of think of when you think of journalists. They're the ones who are going to be behind the desk, behind the microphone, in front of the camera. They're typically writing some of the media content that's delivered. And these general reporters, the big difference between them and a beat reporter is that the general reporter kind of covers whatever goes in front of them. Beat reporters are very specified. They have maybe 1 to 3 or 4 things that they typically write about, and they tend to have deeper understanding of their topic. And we found that a lot of people that do climate change consider themselves kind of in that beat reporter mold because they spend so much time. It's such a there's so much kind of prerequisite knowledge for covering it in an accurate way. We also have producers. So producers, they create the programming, and what I mean by that is they kind of handle the graphics, the mics, the setup, the posting of the show. They're sometimes considered kind of the people that don't necessarily give you the news, but they're responsible for kind of the vehicle in which it's delivered. And then finally, like I said earlier a little bit, freelancers. They can be made up of anybody, but generally they are beat reporters who are no longer with their networks, either because of downsizing or they decided to leave on their own. And they generally use a whole wide variety of mediums to get to that audience. So now, with all of that kind of out of the way, I want to get into some of our findings. So the first group of findings we'll talk about are some of their interests and obstacles, and this isn't every finding from the report. If you want the report's I think each one is over 80 pages, so not going to do that. So if you guys are curious, I can absolutely send it to you. But I'm going to for a first point, over 1/3 of journalists in our sample have worked within climate change in the past year, which is pretty huge considering that these aren't necessarily climate journalists. These are just people that are covering it. And with that, over 4 out of 10 participants said that they had supervised or covered the story within the last 12 months. Nearly all journalists in the sample were interested in covering it, even the ones that hadn't covered it. In fact, 9 out of 10 journalists that were in our sample, 2,000-person sample, said that they're at least slightly interested in reporting on climate change solutions, and 4 out of 10 said they're very interested. And a lot of times, if they were interested but not doing it, it's because they don't feel like they have the skill set or the access and whatnot, and I'll get into that a little bit later. Yeah, like I said, 8 out of 10 participants, they identified that lack of training in climate science. So the fact that they didn't really know how to engage with the material properly is their obstacle for reporting on it, maybe why they didn't. And then also more than half identified lack of time, for field reporting, lack of time and space in the news outlet, and then lack of consistent role models for climate change. I'm talking with my hands too much. Next, kind of looking at the audience and society, very few journalists, contrary to popular belief, actually expected to receive a negative reaction from their audience when they covered climate change, because kind of, some of what we thought kind of stereotypically going into the project was, oh, they may not be covering it because they're scared of, divisiveness or whatever, but that really wasn't the case. Only 1 in 10 of survey participants expected to receive, or did receive, mostly or entirely negative feedback from the audience when they posted it, and kind of in fact, many journalists even believe that covering climate change would be a smart career move. 6 out of 10 in our surveys thought that reporting on climate change would be beneficial to them. And whether that's because it's a new skill set or it's an emerging issue, there are a lot of kind of theories behind that, but 60% over that. And then more importantly, I think most importantly, over 9 out of 10 journalists in our sample believe that reporting on climate change was actually beneficial for society. And more than 7 out of 10 say it's very beneficial. So they don't think it's so essentially from this slide, they don't think it's going to really be negative if they cover it. They think it'd be good for them to cover it, and they think it's good for society. And so now kind of moving on, most journalists actually believe that global warming is happening on top of that. Over 90% of survey participants think that it's happening, and 8 out of 10 believe that they're either sure or extremely sure. And on top of that, most journalists in the sample believe that global warming is harmful. Again, very similar numbers. 9 out of 10 believe that they'll be personally harmed by global warming, and 8 out of 10 believe that they'll be harmed either a moderate amount or great. And harm not just like physical harm, but health, social harm, economic harm, kind of broader terms with that. And then finally, we have all this in mind, yet we see that there are still some journalistic norms that are getting in the way of climate change coverage. So despite the fact that most participants, they're being convinced that human-caused climate change is occurring and harmful, many said that many said that they report 2 sides of a climate story, and it was helpful for for one or more reasons. So we typically will call this false balance, where even though the science is settled about an issue, journalists feel it's their duty to be objective. I keep hitting that. I'm going to move that over there. They feel like it's their duty to be objective. And so as a result, they treat climate change as if it's less settled than it is for the sake of kind of pushing the journalistic norm for it. So 6 out of 10 journalists say that reporting both sides of the story, both sides, will enable them to acknowledge different viewpoints exist, okay? Will help them avoid the appearance of bias, and they say it's essential to objective, balanced journalism, and it'll help maintain their credibility. And also, some journalists report that they're not sure how settled the science actually is. Nearly half of journalists on the sample feel that presenting 2 sides of the climate story is important because the science of climate change is, quote-unquote, still being debated. So moving on from that, I'm going to talk a little bit about my current research with that. So within this big data set, different members of the team, we all kind of look at a different problem that the journalists face, and the one that me and my co-authors are interested in the most are the barriers to climate journalism. Because those barriers, if we can figure out a way to reducing those, my theory is that it'll increase climate reporting, it will increase accurate climate reporting, and since the journalists are really the gatekeepers for a lot of climate information for the general public, I think by accessory, the general public will begin to have a more informed opinion on it too. So we've uncovered 2 pretty important findings through our work so far. We found that barriers are dynamically linked, and it basically means that all those barriers I kind of listed before, and I'll show them again on the next slide, they don't exist in isolation, where if someone is having an issue, with lack of climate training being an issue, they're probably also going to have an issue finding local sources because they don't know necessarily how to find a good source, and they might, for example, feel that their audience isn't going to have a great reaction because they don't know how to write for that audience in whatever their market is. And so we've been able to prove with an exploratory factor analysis that the barriers in the survey are related. And we also have been able to determine that treating all journalists like they're the same and giving them one-size-fits-all training for climate reporting doesn't work because different journalists in different positions within the media perceive barriers differently than one another. So, I'm sorry. So,
I'm trying to squeeze Rafe in, and I see this audience wants to ask some questions.
Sure. So I will fast forward through all this then. Here's how a journalist responded to all the barriers. Dynamically linked barriers, we found that rather than having this huge list before, it makes more sense to just say there are 3: access, support, and time. Here's how, and it's kind of hard to see on the slide, but here's how different positions within the media perceive the different issues, and we did find that there is a wide variety of perspectives on different issues. For example, managers don't think managers are the problem. Kind of funny. People that work more closely with the stories actually feel more efficacious covering them, and that's pretty interesting because that tells us, okay, well, sometimes just doing it can be enough to build those skills. And some of the future directions that we're going to be going in with the research, we're going to try to determine the different needs of journalists, work on specific tailored trainings in different situations. We're also going to try to reduce false balance reporting on climate issues. And we're going to try to create and facilitate easier tools, maybe social media integrated, text, things like that, that will allow journalists to access information in a quicker, more effective way. And I will be happy to take your questions later, because I'm out of time.
Coming soon to a university near you.
Oh, I'm going to
need to be. I just want, Rafe, you can take the stand, but I just want to say, I just yesterday got an email from the place where Josh works saying that they're recruiting PhD students.
Yes.
Yes, and they've got a remarkable program, and there's the young woman who was here at WVU. What's the woman who?
Oh, Lindsay?
Yeah, Lindsay.
Yeah,
Yeah, she was going to speak here, but she couldn't come. And she got Josh to come, but it's really a source of national scholarship, but also providing the generation of teachers and researchers who are going to be in universities all around America talking about climate change. This issue obviously is not going anywhere. And one of the great facets that we're trying to illuminate today is the folks who are working on it in the academy under the disciplines of all these different historic disciplines, psychology, communications. What is your actual, what do you?
Communication.
Communications,
Yeah.
okay.
Communication, yeah.
Yeah, good. So that's our morning thing. Rafe, not in the academy. He used to be a community organizer a long time, but he's got decades of experience. Rafe Pomerance.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. First, I'll try to achieve some solidarity with the audience by taking off my jacket and cool off. So, yes, Tom, and to say thank you to Tom and to Judy, who have been great friends for decades. And we've sat in many restaurants in Davis and Thomas talking about climate change over the years and many other regional conservation issues. I'll be quick. I have another bite at the apple at the end, so that's a good thing. So you don't have to hear it. I only have so many things I can say. So first, self-promotion. But this actually is a major communications moment. Anybody ever see this, the magazine itself? No? August 4th? You're kidding. This was the whole issue of the New York Times Magazine called Losing the Planet. And the whole issue, I'll say that again. And when you open it up, the first photo, you might not recognize this guy, see? Take it in, that's me. I became famous, in case you didn't know. Who? Thank you. It was an amazing moment. I worked with the author, or say, for about a year and a half, and it's coming out, this article, which you can find online, is coming out as a book in April, which is the 40th anniversary of, at the moment, 40 years ago, I started my work where this article begins. And I guess but I think just to interpret this as a communications moment, I actually think journalism in this country has made a huge shift on climate change. And it might be because the New York Times decided to tell everybody, this is really important. You know, we're going to devote the whole issue of the magazine to this question. And it's quite incredible, I think, you know, both the Times and Washington Post have their own sort of climate change teams. Pretty impressive, the change that's gone on. Let me make comments on two recent events. Here's a communication strategy. When the other guys make the mistake, This is the story. So what happened? Was it last week? What went on? Didn't we have a holiday? Anybody know? Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving. And what's the day after called? Excellent. And what was the climate moment on Black Friday? Anybody know? Yes, you all had the right answer. The National Climate Assessment was released that afternoon. Black Friday, 2 o'clock. The worst time for a report to come out. Nobody reads the papers. Nobody pays any attention, right? So the slick people in the White House figured out this is when we'll release the report. Nobody will pay any attention, and we will have sunk 4 years of 1,000 scientists' work deep into the Potomac River. So what happened? It backfired. Everybody figured out they were trying to bury this thing, and they decided to play it up. And it made the front pages all over the country. The New York Times put it on the top of the fold. Now, it's not easy getting the top of the fold with a climate report, okay? It happens. But why did they do that? What do you think their message was? It was a message to the White House. I think, screw you. We're going to just put this thing way up here because you tried to dump this in the Potomac. We're not going to let you get away with that. And the Washington Post did the same thing. I'm convinced it was sort of a vengeful act. I would never say something. Wait, I'm on the record here. Scratch that. Scratch that. Media is one of our great, the free press is a critical ally for all of us all the time. So that's Black Friday. Second event of actually yesterday that's a way to kind of think of the early days of this and how it happened was the death of President Bush. Now, many of you may not know of the role that George H.W. Bush played as a candidate and as a president. But when he was attacking Michael Dukakis, you may remember the governor of Massachusetts, his major attack, this is another form of communications, occurred in a speech at Boston Harbor. Because Boston Harbor was a mess. And Bush took advantage of this to attack the liberal Democrat on the environment in a speech at Boston Harbor. Now, you don't hear anything about this in all these, commentaries on the life of President Bush. But that speech was a big deal in his winning campaign and hugely important on the environment. You may remember the phrase, those who are worried about the greenhouse effect are ignoring the White House effect. It's a pretty good one-liner, even for a presidential candidate, right? I don't usually talk about Republicans this way, but this Bush saw the strategic opening and his campaign, and the issue of climate change had become big enough by that point. They made that pledge, and the biggest outcome from that pledge was the negotiation of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was achieved in Rio in 1992. And that sentence that Bush offered, we never let him forget it. We got that into editorials in the New York Times everywhere. As the whenever they would fall back, we would push that sentence back out there. So it's worth remembering that was 30 to 40 years ago all that happened, that the issue was understood, the science was understood. The first meeting of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change occurred the day after Bush was elected. It was in Geneva. So we've been going at it for a long time. Let me just briefly touch on some of the issues in communication that I see as a practitioner. I'm an advocate, I'm a policy person. I've been involved with scientists, with the media. I was in the State Department for 6 years as a U.S. negotiator. I've been an organizer on this. So I come at it from a lot of different episodes. The first is an underlying, why is everybody working so hard to try to figure out how you communicate climate change? Well, one reason is that we have been the victims of a massive propaganda campaign. That sounds really, that's not what I normally say. But what ExxonMobil did, they had scientists who understood this issue and its gravity. And their PR people reversed their strategy. Instead of saying this is really serious, we've got to take it, they funded all kinds of front groups and made ad campaigns that essentially said that this doesn't exist. This is all about uncertainty. We don't really know anything when we know a lot. And my perception is that what is embedded in the U.S. population, and when you see these conservative Republicans, you have to remember that there was an organized campaign to undermine what was well understood in the scientific community. And we suffer that legacy in this country now because we don't have the political will to act. The world can't move without us, really. And you can't get anything. You say, well, there's 6 people on a carbon tax bill. That's great. And it's bipartisan. That's great. But at the end of the last Congress, Scalise, the leader from Louisiana, the state that is going under, offered a resolution in opposition to a carbon tax because the Koch brothers said, time for you to do this. Let's get everybody on the record so we can use it against them. Didn't work. The Democrats took the House. So leaving aside the sort of politics and how you feel about it, this is a factor. Denialism is not an accident. And that problem is with us. It's serious. And how do you overcome that? I think bringing the theoretical analysis to all the people who do media on this is a really good idea. I'm sitting here thinking, I'm really resistant to these guys. They have good analysis, and I don't listen to them. I just do what I want. I do this the way I want. But I think people who do this day to day actually could use some help in kind of framing this. So I offer my wish that could happen. Next is collaboration, even with people who know more than you do about something. When you're feeling really defensive, right? And you don't want to learn anymore. Collaborate. Okay. Next question, impacts. Now here's the secret politically, impacts. That's what Tom talked about, the impacts. And you listen to Tom, he knows every impact in the Allegheny Mountains, in this region, and how you lay that out for people so they know what's coming. Well, my view of impacts is what I call climate impact strategy. The way to win is to create the political platform locally on the basis of impacts that you can attribute to climate change that are well understood. And let me explain how that wins the next presidential election, just to get your attention, okay? I'll let it go quiet for a minute here. Then Florida. What happens to Florida with climate change? Yes. It is existentially threatened by sea level rise. Much of Florida lays on limestone. We know about limestone. It's porous. You can't build a seawall around it. So this election, there were 3 statewide races that came down to a fraction of a percent. Tragically, Bill Nelson lost. He was very good on this. But if 8.5 million people voted, if a small fraction of Florida Republicans and independents shift, the Republican Party has to have Florida to win a presidential election. They have to have it. And once this issue is well enough understood, the theory goes, you guys should critique it, the politics shift. And that has begun to happen. There are many great Republican electeds in local electeds in Florida are moving on this because they are experiencing sea level rise now. And there's a host of other impacts in Florida that are very serious. So that's the climate impact strategy. It's a communication strategy. We just did, I have partners down there. We did a press event, a press conference this week on the National Climate Assessment. We had 40 people on the phone. This was a Florida-based event. Probably 2/3 of them were reporters. There was a lot of coverage of the National Climate Assessment in Florida because the media there has finally begun to understand that this is an existential threat. And 3 papers in South Florida, the Sun Sentinel, Miami Herald, Palm Beach Post have formed a collaborative called the Invading Seas. And their opening line is that this is the #1 issue for Florida in the 21st century. So that's a big change. Okay, how do we bring two more, I'll just offer two more issues. Themes. One is how do we bring a bipartisan effort together? We have to have a bipartisan effort to get this done. You can't do it on a partisan basis. The Democrats, when they chose to do, I was part of it, the BTU tax in '93, the Markey-Waxman bill later on. If you do energy pricing, carbon tax, without Republicans, what they'll do is they'll just come back and hammer you in the election. They have to be part of it. Well, now we have, for example, we have a $900 billion deficit. $900 billion. Where's the revenue going to come from to help close that gap? It's either value-added tax, sales tax, or carbon tax, or raising back up the corporate income tax, something like that. So there's a driver there beyond climate, but it has to be bipartisan. What's the word? The word that can capture that is innovation. Because your list there, if you ask the Republicans, they love innovation. Democrats like innovation too. R&D, policies to stimulate innovation. So I think that innovation is a winning communications concept. Everybody knows we have to innovate to win, economically and environmentally. And both parties like that word. And what does it mean? First, policy is that we should expand what's known as ARPA-E. Many of you may not know, that's a high-risk R&D agency in DO. Oh, applause. We get money here from them? Yes. You're an investor. You have a project? You do. Excellent. This is designed to put dollars behind high-risk R&D that can lower the cost of transition of climate. So we need to raise the budget of that to the equivalent of what the Pentagon's version is DARPA, which is $5 to $6 billion a year. We're only spending about 250 or 300 million on this. All we're talking about is the fate of the planet. So, final point, how do you get greater ambition and urgency in the system? A part of it's this impacts in Florida. Part of it is pointing to the Arctic, curiously. Because I'll talk more about this later, but the Arctic is unraveling. It is unraveling. Sea ice, which is the reflectivity of the planet. Permafrost is thawing. It has double the carbon content of the atmosphere as it thaws. You get a big positive feedback. And finally, the fate of Greenland is the fate of Miami and every other coastal city in the world, because Greenland has ultimately 7 meters of sea level rise, and it's shrinking. It's not going to produce that much, that kind of number that fast, but it is accelerating now. And the point of the Arctic story is to create greater ambition and urgency in the global negotiations. So I'll talk more about that later. Thank you.
We have a website for this conference, and it's just had a couple pages on it so far with one of the speakers and all that, and our intention is to do that, yeah, when we get there. Do you have a question? I'm going to say something first. We're going to go till 10:30, then we're going to take a break. If you look at your schedule, better stick to it. And we're going to break for 15 minutes, and then we're going to come back and talk about more about climate communications, more in the classroom field. Is there anybody here who hadn't registered yet, which we encourage people just to come on in when we're started. I think you can still go outside and register at a table there and get your little sticker that shows your personal birth year CO2 concentration. I like the impacts of climate change, and I like to personalize it too. And so, what was the state of the atmosphere when you were born, and what have you been part of, not wittingly or intentionally, but what have you been part of to get us up to 406? I go back to the big 310 cohort. There And we have later cohorts over 350. Anybody? Yeah, I see you. I see that's the later cohort. You've been going faster, I noticed. But anyhow, let's get your questions. Just raise your hand. I'll call on you, and then you can direct it to whoever the speaker is. You guys don't have to go up to the podium if you don't want to. These microphones, I think, are working. Jamie?
Hello. Yep.
Okay, how about you?
This is a question for all of the panelists. How would you advise engaging pro-coal West Virginians about climate change? Repeat the question.
Could you repeat the question? One of you guys who heard it?
You want me to repeat it or you want?
Oh. I'm sorry.
How would you advise engaging pro-coal West Virginians about climate change?
What are your thoughts about engaging pro-coal West Virginians about climate?
Oh, sure. Thanks for softball. I mean, I thought maybe this would come up a little later, but right off the bat. Well, I think pro-coal West Virginians, well, first of all, is to acknowledge the huge role that West Virginia has played in providing energy to this country. That's the first thing. The second thing is to say we have a big problem with carbon dioxide, and coal is a big part of that. And at some point, for the future of coal, is dependent on technologies that can capture the carbon and sequester it. Otherwise, the future of coal is even more problematic. So if I would advise getting behind massive R&D to find a new, to find cost efficient technologies for coal use that don't produce carbon. And I think that the critique of coal is building, and it poses a risk for the West Virginia economy not to get out in front of that and say, look, we can't rely on the fact that the whole world is going to let us burn coal in light of the consequences of climate change. So we better get out in front and develop, and believe me, there's plenty of federal money to do this, if there was a deal, to provide an alternative future which includes carbon capture and carbon sequestration, but recognize that there's a transition underway that it's better to be part of than not.
Can I add something there?
Wait, just a sec. Wait. Hold on.
Uneconomical.
Hold on.
Beating it without sequestration.
Let's not debate. Let's just get some questions and get some responses. Really, if we got into a debate, where we're going to go? Let's try questions and responses. See where we do. Emily.
Yeah. So I just want to thank you all for coming here today. You guys did a really good job with your presentations, and you all are witty and great communicators. And I am curious why I can't find you all on Twitter, because I think you do amazing on Twitter. We've all talked about how to engage younger people on climate change, and 40% of active users on Twitter are adults under the age of 29. So I would encourage you to bring your research to Twitter if you can. And then a question for Josh about,
Yes.
you had talked about how journalists, the reasons why journalists may be hesitant to cover climate change, and talked about how it really wasn't that they were afraid of a backlash.
Sure.
I'm wondering if you looked at the difference between women and men on that issue.
We did collect the data on the journalists as part of the demographic information, but we did not run an analysis based on gender of anything. We do, for at least for that particular issue, but we did find that I believe only 1 in 10 was expecting backlash, and I think our sample, I want to say our sample was like 54% female, I think. So just doing the math, I think it's something like that. Don't quote me on that, but I think it's around there. And so I think that the reason we haven't run that test yet is because such a small piece of our sample reported having that problem compared to other problems. It is on the list, though. We are going to make meaningful comparisons like that at some point. Yes. Thank you.
You guys want to say anything about Twitter?
Yeah, I'll just add on to that real quick. So
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely correct, and even better than Twitter's Instagram. So I actually started the Instagram page for the CCLDC. I don't know. Is it on? I don't know.
It's just not very loud.
All right. Is this better? Yes? Okay. So I work with the Citizens Climate Lobby DC chapter, and I actually started the Instagram page for that chapter. So I'm Citizens Climate Lobby DC is the handle. But there's a Citizens Climate Lobby overall Instagram page, and I encourage you all to follow that.
If anyone's tweeting, I've made a hashtag for today called hashtag 2018 National Energy Conference. If you're tweeting from this event.
Great.
Thanks.
You know, I should be tweeting. I'm going to say. Ken.
Oh, hi. It's a two-parter, so I'll get it out as quickly as I can. First part on the psychology and the President of the United States using your thing. What would be your psychology for changing his mind? And the second part is for not changing his mind, but at least softening his approach, perhaps. And then the second part for Rafe, which is on the oil companies, and the issue being that the oil companies had basically signed these pledges, or whatever you would call it, to reduce their carbon emissions, that they now accept the findings of climate change. Yeah. And is this a factor of that they're now you're also exploring for natural gas, which is replacing coal, or is this an epiphany that they have just come to, or is it a marketing approach, or whatnot? But then the other part of that is, if they're there, why fight about where they've been? And I'll let you guys decide who answers first.
Well, you get fixed.
Thanks for the softball there. That's it. No. Okay, so on the one hand, you could probably make a good argument that Trump is just a psychological anomaly, and there might not be a way to change his mind specifically. But I think that if you could show him the investment value in green energy, that he'd get behind it. I think that he cares more about that than, and what I'm talking about is personally him making money is more important than any policy or any ideological belief. So, yeah, that's sure. If it increases his bottom line, I think he'll go for it.
I just had my part B to that. I offered you an answer that sea level rise will decide the next presidential election. So if you don't get on board, you're going to lose. Now, you've heard wishful thinking before. That might be a form of it. But it's not altogether without, because there are a lot of studies going on property values in Florida now, and, you know, the rate of sales and stuff. People are waking up, including insurance companies and mortgage companies. On the oil industry, you know, the oil industry seeded denialism. They sponsored it, they financed it, and now they're stuck because they can't eliminate it unless they were to spend an enormous amount in, and talk to our friends here, in advertising, social media, Twitter. Can you imagine? ExxonMobil tweets, this is serious, we got to deal with this, we're going out of business. No, I'm trying some new lines here. But so I think that, here's the reason. ExxonMobil put up $1 million. They support a carbon tax. Nobody can find them supporting a carbon tax. They say it. Where are they? You know, there was a referendum in Washington State on a carbon tax this year. So who put up $35 million in opposition? The oil industry, mostly BP. Maybe they have refineries there or something. So it's very curious. I don't really know where they are. You probably, if different people in different places. But could you imagine if they got their act together and put their shoulders to the wheel to get the right marketplace price and decided we really have to solve this, for, Ann said, for several generations. This is a multi-generational problem.
Let me get another question, right?
Sorry.
No, that's
that was
right.
too good. Trump,
you know. Let me see. You get somebody from the, okay, what's your cohort? I have to make sure every cohort is represented. What's your PPM? Yeah.
326.
326. Okay, you're allowed. Your cohort needs to be represented. I just want to say something. By the way, we're going to have a number of speakers this afternoon talking about natural gas and the carbon consequences of natural gas. And there's another industry that we're going to say, was coming along in maybe a positive direction until the presidential election. And now it's kind of, where are they? But one can still hope. So we'll talk about that this afternoon a little bit. Go ahead.
Yes, my question is to Mr. Murphy.
Oh.
The concept of using webcasters or weather forecasters as
Climate educators.
sounds really great. Problem is, I haven't looked at actually a weather forecast on TV in 5 years on my phone. So how do you now direct that same strategy?
Sure.
To that new medium?
That is an excellent question. And it actually ties into the question that earlier that another audience member brought up. But a lot of weathercasters, they're no longer just broadcasting on television, but a lot of times they're blogging. They are on social media, whether that's personally or for whatever station they're on. And we find that while not necessarily all Americans are going to be getting, their news necessarily from the weathercasters, we still know that a lot of social science theories told us that opinion formation comes largely from peer groups. So all it takes is a few people on someone's personal network to be engaging with news, and then internalizing, okay, this climate change is happening. They get a couple facts, they start to engage with the issue, and then when it comes up in, just private conversation, workplace, whatever, they've kind of started to work towards having that pro-climate belief. So really, that while the climate weathercasters are doing the educating, the real educators, I feel like, are the audience members that take away something from it. So it's kind of a two-part kind of system, having them do it. And another reason too that we've kind of expanded the program to the Climate Matters in the newsroom for all positions is also to kind of address what you were speaking about, that not everyone watches the weather anymore, or watches the weathercast. And so by incorporating journalists that aren't only covering weather, but are also writing about regular environment topics, or maybe writing about politics or real estate or anything like that, teaching them how to weave in climate when they choose to, I feel like also increases kind of the net that we're able to grab people with. That makes sense.
That's all. Let's give these guys a fabulous hand. They did great. All right. Emily, could you stand up for just a second so I can recognize you, so people will get it? Emily Calandrelli is our lunchtime keynote speaker, and she asked a question, so I want you all to see her. She's going to talk about all kinds of stuff in her work. It's amazing, heroic Morgantowner going out in the world doing all kinds of great stuff in science education. And we're going to come back. We're going to talk to 3 classroom teachers and researchers in the climate area who work here in West Virginia. We'll be back in 15 minutes. You can register outside. There's lots of coffee and danishes and all that stuff out there.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, if everybody, Jamie's going to go outside and make some noises, but we're going to get started. Tina Cartwright was the state climatologist of West Virginia. You bet you didn't know we had a state climatologist, did you? I had a friend who used to be the state bee inspector. Now that was a nice job. Bardwell, he traveled all over the state doing these beards with his bees, and it's nice when a state has people with specialized knowledge who work for the benefit of the people. Tina can talk a little bit about her professional background. We've got it listed in some of the stuff, but at the moment you're working as a teacher, correct?
Right there, I have it.
Oh, here it is. Here's her background. I don't need to say anything about it then. Come on in, everybody. We're going to start out by hearing from Tina Cartwright. We're going to hear from 3 people who are in the classroom, working with students every day, who just have forgotten more about how people feel and react about the science of climate change than probably most of us will ever knew, and have made lots of mistakes, I think, and can talk us through some of those mistakes and what they've learned. And then hopefully will tell us a little bit, too, about what they still want to know, what they're still struggling with as they pursue this. You know, I thought this whole program, in a way, especially I'll say this for the non-white-haired folks who aren't in my old cohort here, this program's a little bit of a job fair. Not that we're hiring, but not that we're hiring, but that these people who are speaking, who are in the academy, many of them, or in the school systems, that they're modeling careers. Climate change, as I say, it's not going away. It's a growth industry, if anything. And there are opportunities for people with all kinds of professional and personal leanings. I don't care whether they're banjo players or apiarists or climatologists to participate. And what we're trying to do is highlight a lot of different opportunities that there are to work in the climate field. The best way to highlight that is to have folks up here who are going to model it. So let's welcome Tina. Thank you.
Welcome everyone back at the break. I just wanted to give a little background information because I am a West Virginia native, first-generation college student. Had the pleasure of attending West Virginia University. You might have heard of it. And I highlighted the most 2 important words on the slide, and it's because I participated as a Goldwater Scholar in undergraduate research that really expanded my horizon in terms of thinking, PhD. That may be something I could do, because that was for sure I'm from Charleston area, in between Charleston and Huntington, and so I knew no one doing that kind of academic research or working at a university. I knew I was interested in the weather. I did a 7th grade science fair project, actually, on the weather, using current clouds to predict future weather. That is kind of a thing when you have a front coming through. But otherwise, the data doesn't really show a lot of trends there. But it involved me going to the National Weather Service, and I've always liked technology. You know, I was the kid that would tear apart the pin during church, right? Church gets boring. So you find ways to distract yourself. And so I was always interested in technology, and so I was enamored by the radar. And also, I wasn't afraid to, as I was doing in the hallway, going upstream, right? Being the kid who was telling the answer a little different than everyone else, right? What do you want to be when you grow up? And so I said, from the age of about 12, I wanted to be a meteorologist. And so I pathed that out, even through WVU. I always tell my students now that I wrote letters. You remember the ones with stamps, right? To other colleges and universities to try to duplicate a program, at least the prerequisites to go to graduate school in meteorology. And Ken Martis, I have to say wonderful things about my advisor in the geography department here at WVU, was super supportive in that goal and that quest. And so it ended up, I received my doctorate in meteorology, but at that time I was becoming more and more involved in science education and outreach and coming back home to West Virginia. And so I didn't know really what that meant career-wise, but I knew I had kids, and I wanted them to be here, and I wanted my family to help support me raising them. And so we moved back home to West Virginia, and I started working at State to try to build a meteorology program at West Virginia State, and that turned into working more and more with teachers and outreach. And now I find myself at doing science education full-time at Marshall University. And so this area of research that I have developed over the last decade or so is really me trying to bridge the gap between I was trained as a meteorologist, but now I do science education. So I'm really curious about how our home climate, right, our sensitivity to sort of seasonal variations impacts our understanding or belief in climate change and climate variability. And so that's what I'll talk a little bit more later. This distinction between current weather, right, and long-term climate impacts is really hard for our mental mind to make, right? There's been a fair amount of research, and I'll talk a little bit about it, about understanding of geologic time and geologic time scale. Our brain can't handle that, and particularly when we start teaching about this in the middle school level, are you kidding me, right? A week from now is forever when you're 12, right? So last summer was so long ago. So we're talking about really long time scales in geologic time frames, but in meteorology we start to talk that way as well when we talk about climate and climate variability and climate impacts. Oops. And so we really are focused on that. It's a conceptualization issue as much as well as understanding or politics. It's really hard for our students and some adults to conceptualize this and find a distinguishing factor between a snowstorm, right, and climate change. I prefer climate change because we're talking about precipitation pattern shifts, which are really going to impact our survivability on this planet. And so I'm interested in also in terms of the sensitivity that we're sort of grown up. We live in the mid-latitudes, right? We have big swings between summer and winter. So what's a few degrees in warming? Whereas if you live in some of these places that later people are going to talk about in the Arctic and in the tropical regions, they're niche climate, and they have very small variability from season to season. And so they have a different perception of risk associated with a warming trend. And so I'll talk a little bit. I have a movie, it's a documentary that I'll kind of feature again at the end of the talk called The Anthropologist, as another mechanism to communicate this issue. And so I wanted to bring to you sort of this evolution of student expectations with our standards. So West Virginia recently adapted, and I'll come back to that as well, the next generation science standards. These came into effect in 2016 and were adopted by our K-12 school system. And you can kind of see here, these are the evolution of what's expected in grade 5, grade 8, and by grade 12. And you can kind of, these are the sort of the phrases that come to, that are related back to weather versus climate and understanding the complex issues associated with climate change. So if we look at this more detailed in terms of the exact language of the expectations for our students and for our teachers to deliver to the students, you can see that it begins in kindergarten. And that's what the K stands for at the first letter. So K is kindergarten. Then we can see third grade, 3, and then middle school is the MS. And then there on the right-hand side, the climate starts a little bit later and extends through high school. The HS is through the high school. And so ultimately by high school, we're hoping that students have engaged in understanding how climate has been influenced by human activity, right? So my research has been really focused on that middle level student understanding, ages 13 to 15, because prior to NGSS, that's where they were getting it. There was nothing else, right? Nothing else in the standards related to climate and or weather at the high school level. And so it was really falling to our middle school educators. And so my work, I was had the opportunity to build on a published work from Boone, and she looked at Australian and UK students at the same age at very different time frames in 1991 and 2001. And this was the sample. I'll present some of my work that I took place in 2011 with follow-up to those same students in 2015 when they were in high school, in terms of how did their understanding change or perceptions change about climate. And so that's what I kind of sort of outline here in sort of a three-phase approach. Phase one, comparing instantaneous 2011 students with Boone students in 1991 and 2001. And then I was able to follow up with these same students in high school in 2015. And then now I'm beginning really to look at the student understanding after our implementation of the next generation science standards. So I sampled students, again, that were in middle school prior to the NGSS implementation, and then they've just, again, did the survey as ninth graders after experiencing our middle school curriculum. And I hope to follow up again with them when they're seniors as well. So this is a sort of a snapshot of a few answers to the survey that myself and Boone, using her work, developed. And so for me, fundamentally, greenhouse effect, friend or foe, right? I mean, it's fundamental to survivability of our planet, right? And so, you know, these are their responses. And so, I mean, we have to be careful with press in terms of supporting the thought that carbon dioxide is a pollution. Well, please, everyone, hold your breath, right? Carbon dioxide is a natural, important component to the Earth atmosphere system. What we're talking about is an enhanced greenhouse effect, right? And that enhancement is an important part. And so I sort of approach, we need to understand the science, which it's complex, it's hard, it's difficult, and then let each individual decide in terms of the politics that goes beyond that. And so where do greenhouse gases come from? Right, so this is a look at our middle school students. They did pretty well, right? Combination of both human and natural sources. Now we compare with international population, right? This was the published study from Boone, from the UK and Australian students, in terms of thinking about where, how do we change the amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere? And so the percent that you see is the percent of students that got it correct. That the three answers that are highlighted in red were those that we did significantly poorly compared to the international students. And again, these are international students of the same age, 10 and 20 years prior to our West Virginia students answering these questions. So it's quite interesting. So following these same students, right, that I sampled in 2011, you see the N equals 44. I actually found 44 of them again in 2015. You can see how their responses changed. So this is how, again, we impact the amount of greenhouse gases by burning of oil, planting trees, expanding the ozone, which is a common misconception related to climate change. Using alternative energy, insulating buildings and structures, and driving automobiles. And you can compare our student responses and how they changed over time and those international population. So we didn't do better than our international counterpoints, right? So that's with our past standards-based instruction. So maybe I can be optimistic, I don't know, with our current standards. Unfortunately, they're a product of their educators, right? And so working with educators, working with those who teach educators to address this issue, I think, is most paramount, particularly at an institution of higher education, which is training and preparing those future educators. And so, you know, again, supporting all of the research, these are the primary recommendations and where they had difficulty across international. So my recommendations, right, it's important for it to take place at more than one grade level. And, you know, we call it a learning progression. And so it should be an issue that is faced multiple times over the K-12 series with more and more complexity. And so we need to really focus on those aspects that are most commonly misunderstood. We call them misconceptions related to these issues, because our teachers hold those same misconceptions. And so that's being perpetuated, of course, in the classroom. But it's undoubtedly, we have to recognize where our students come from, right? And in West Virginia, we come from a really unique place. Because, you know, when these standards were put up for public comment, there were very few comments until, right, someone made some changes to the standards language. And then suddenly they put them out for comment again the second time, and there were thousands of comments, thousands of hits, and we had the unfortunate opportunity to be in the national level press, right? And I think this comment, which was a response to our changing the language of some of the standards, the Board of Education saw fit to soften the language of the standards. You know, these were standards that I was on the committee. Each of the states provided feedback to those who were writing the science standards. It was a very slow and methodical process over a 2-year time frame. We had experts from all across West Virginia, both content as well as science educators, as well as other states as well, who were part of that writing team. And so they were very well grounded in science as we currently know and understand it. And so our Board of Education softened the language of several of the secondary science standards related to climate change. In science education, we kind of relate this, wow, this feels a lot like evolution 20 years ago, right? I mean, that was a big deal, and there was a lot of pushback and a lot of issues associated with it. Now, evolution just slid right in. Unfortunately, in 20 years, it might be too late for us to really consider a lot of climate change issues. And so I thought this was a really nice, thoughtful comment in response to the issues that our state leaders had with the standards. And in terms of future, as Todd, he mentioned, this is where I hope to see is that we can better prepare our educators to understand these issues so that in turn gets translated into the classroom with more clarity so that we can increase knowledge, even though that might not impact actions. That's one level that we can work with together on that. And lastly, I wanted to point your attention to this recent documentary. I had the opportunity for Seth Kramer, one of the directors, to come and speak to my elementary science methods. So I teach that course, how to teach science for elementary educators, and it was fascinating. One I saw, the anthropologist is about Susan Crate, who's a professor from George Mason, I think, in Virginia. Who studies cultural anthropology of places and communities that are impacted by climate change, right? She's spent a lot of time in Siberia, and there's work of hers and community events that are featured in Siberia as well as in the Andes and as well as in the islands, I think it was the Maldives, that are very much impacted, and they're finding new islands to move to. Right? I mean, it's really amazing. But the documentary is really a non-traditional approach to it, because it's really through the lens of her teenage daughter that goes with her to meet these communities, and about how she talks about this issue with friends down the street that are the same age and who talk about, I'm not sure, my parents don't really seem to believe in it. And so they talk about that in a really non-traditional way. And so I just wanted to call your attention to that. So when I had Seth come into my class, he's like, I think what we do is a lot alike. We're trying to convince people who are kind of afraid of science that this is something important and it's going, and we need to think about it. Even though we might not fully understand and have all the knowledge, that's really difficult to achieve for everyone. We need to still talk about it and it be a part of our consciousness. So anyway, I highly recommend. It's on Amazon Prime for anyone who's a member. So it's called The Anthropologist. It just came out. So if you have any questions, I am on Twitter. Tina Cartwright is my hashtag. So thank you.
I need to say something about questions. I was told that, those were great questions. We had a good discussion. From my point of view, sitting here, it sounded pretty good. But several people said that some people in the audience couldn't hear the questions when they were asked. And there is a system, which I didn't know about, for writing on a card. And you've been handed a card, most people, that you can write a question on. And there's folks at the back of the room who will come and collect your card. You just wave it around, pass it out to the end of the aisle, and they'll bring them down to me, and I'll sort of look through them a little bit, and maybe I can. That doesn't mean we won't call on people to put their hands up, but that might work better. So, is that good? Did I say the right thing? Okay. Let's. Amy, you're going to go next. You introduce yourself. All right, that's fine. Amy Hessl is one of West Virginia University's. I'll introduce her enough to say that she's one of our academic superstars and has traveled many places in the world to do paleoclimatology, which is the reconstruction of past climates using dendrology, tree rings, but she's part of the larger community of paleoclimatologists who are involved in putting together understandings of the past climate, the relationship to things like these CO2 levels and all that. And with that, and she's got a lab that's very cool, and a lot of her students are all over the place, and I'm sure the university is very proud of her. So, and she encouraged us when we started doing these programs 5 years ago. We met at a coffee shop, and you said, "Yeah, go ahead, I'll come." So we took her up on it. Amy Hessl.
Thank you. So I'm really quite honored and humbled to follow on the previous speakers. And as mentioned, most of my work deals with looking at the last 2,000 years of climate variability using the rings of trees. And so I've done work in Inner Asia, and I'm now working in Southern Australia and Tasmania, looking at past climate variability and how it relates to current extremes. So that's sort of my research interest. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is more how I've been teaching climate change in the classroom and giving presentations to local groups like Rotary clubs and so forth. And over time, so I've been here since 2001, and over time I've developed what I call the 5-slide slam dunk, which unfortunately isn't really a slam dunk. So, and I'll explain that. I've basically developed like a very short presentation that I believe provides like the most important data. But as we saw from previous speakers, thank you very much, Dylan, what's interesting is that I can give this presentation to someone who's really, a real denier, and they will get on board. But 20 minutes later, they've slid back. So there's something really interesting about that, and I'll provide you with this presentation anyway, and then I think it's some sort of food for discussion afterwards, like what happens there, right? So I give this presentation also in different forms to my classes at the undergraduate level, so from freshmen all the way up to graduate students who are in PhD programs. And my goal there is really to get people to the point where they can clearly communicate what the factual evidence is and be confident that they have the major pieces put together in their minds, so that when they have a conversation with someone, they can actually say, well, this is the data, this is where you can see the data, and they can be confident about their explanations. So that's kind of my goal with this. So how are we so sure? And I actually think this is a fairly simple science. I don't think it takes a highly educated person to understand this. I think it's actually fairly straightforward. But I start off my presentation by showing people a graph like this with the y-axis removed. So, and I ask, Do you think this is the Dow Jones? Could this be Earth's temperature? What could it be? Pirates? Like, what is it? And then I just leave it there, okay? Then I'd like to address the following questions. So how is it that scientists are so sure about this? Do greenhouse gases warm the Earth? We can answer that. Are the greenhouse gases ours? Are temperatures actually getting warmer? Are human causes of warming more important than natural causes? And does this matter? It's perhaps the most important question for people. So we've known that CO2 is a greenhouse gas and it traps heat in the atmosphere. We've known this since at least 1861. This is John Tyndall's instrument that he used to assess that. And of course, if there's any engineers in the audience, you might be aware of Jean-Baptiste Fourier and the Fourier transform. He was one of the first people to understand that there must be a role of the atmosphere in keeping Earth's temperature at a cozy 59 degrees on average. So we've known that for a long time. Are these gases increasing as a result of human activity? And we started measuring this, of course, in the late 1950s, early 1960s on Mauna Loa volcano, and we now have these stations all over the world, right, where we can look at the rise of CO2 in this example in the atmosphere. So increasing parts per million. We can also see the seasonal signal there, where northern hemisphere ecosystems draw down CO2 when they're active, and when those northern hemisphere ecosystems go dormant in the wintertime, we have a release of CO2 to the atmosphere. How do we know those greenhouse gases are ours? Well, the ones that we burn, the fossil fuels that we burn, actually have an isotopic signature that tells us that these gases are ours. So at the same time, the total concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is going up. We have a special chemical signature in the CO2 that tells us that the CO2 that we're burning is part of the increase. So ironically, we see this level of delta 13C isotope going down as we increase the amount of old carbon that we're burning and putting into the atmosphere. So we know there's a chemical fingerprint there, so we can track that. Is Earth's temperature actually rising? This is the one that most people are aware of and we have confidence in, and I'm pretty certain most people are aware of this fact, right? We can see the global mean temperature estimates based on, here we have a NASA GISS for total land and ocean temperatures rising since the 1880s up to present time. We can also see some interesting patterns in that data set, where we have a flattening in the 1960s and 70s, and then the most recent El Nino event as the peak temperature last year. And then we can also see the seasonal changes occurring globally. So if we look at, on the right-hand side there, if we look at the NASA GISS temperature from January to December, so we can see the seasonal cycle changing. The blue values are early in the record, and the red values are going to 2018. So we know that we're seeing a changing seasonal cycle. And are temperatures warmer than they have been recently? So we can look, and this is where my research area is mostly placed. So temperatures are now warmer than they have been in at least the last 1,500 years. So this is a combination of the instrumental data here for summertime, northern hemisphere summertime temperatures, May, June, July, and August in red, and a reconstruction of those temperatures from paleoclimate records, things like tree rings, ice cores, and corals going back in time. And we can see that though there were periods when temperatures were warm, relatively speaking, recent temperatures are pretty extreme, and we're heading in a very, very quickly paced change towards warmer temperatures. So relative to the last 1,500 years, so in the time that Western civilization has really developed, we see relatively stable conditions compared to now. Now there's some interesting deviations there that are worth talking about. So we can see these peaks in temperatures during the medieval times in the northern hemisphere. right around the year 1000. There's like some peak temperatures there that may rival recent conditions, but they are only the most extreme estimates rival current conditions. And then we can see temperatures, the lower temperatures of the 1700s and 1800s that we think of as the Little Ice Age. And this is when, the Thames froze over and things like that. So the small changes in the past that are dwarfed by current change, those small changes actually had big impacts on societies. So during the medieval times, you could grow wine grapes in England, and there were actually fairly large changes to social systems at that time, and as well as the cold temperatures during the Little Ice Age having some societal impacts. So the AR5 is a suite of climate models, and so those are estimated temperatures based on climate models independent of actual paleoclimate data. So just how the model behaves based on what we know about natural variability in the climate system. And we'll get back to that in just a minute. It's a great question. Thank you. So getting back to our original slide, we can now see that that, in fact, was not the Dow Jones, but it is global change in temperature anomalies. This is a series of figures that will illustrate that our contributions to recent warming are major given what we know about the climate system and its natural variability. So this was produced by Ed Hawkins, who's at the National Center for Atmospheric Science at the University of Reading in the UK, and he's also an IPCC AR5 contributing author. And he's got this great series that explains how we know that things like changes in the sunspot cycle or El Nino or longer-term changes like planetary geometry, like how those things are important, but not in this particular case. So here we have the model estimates based on only natural forcing. So everything we know about how the atmosphere works and its natural variability. And there's some interesting little dips in that. Those are some recent eruptions you might recognize, Mount Pinatubo and so forth, and you can see the temperature decrease during those events in the past. So we have things like volcanic eruptions included here. But we can't represent the change in recent temperature just given this natural forcing. If we add the natural forcing plus the anthropogenic forcing, then our models become much closer to reality. So the reality being that black line, which is the actual temperature of Earth. And so we have a much better estimate if we include the anthropogenic forcing with the natural forcing. So does it matter? So that's the most important question for us to decide as individuals and as a society. So if we don't reduce emissions, we can expect the planet to warm about 9 degrees C by 2100, or sorry, 9 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. So this is the forecast, and there's some variations in those estimates. But one of the things I like to tell students is that and I don't have the slide for this here, but the big change in our estimates of future temperature is actually what we do. So that's the most important source of uncertainty, is what we decide to do about CO2 and other greenhouse gases. So the ending question, of course, is if it's real, why haven't we done anything? And this is the topic that is of most interest to me when I'm talking to young people, so particularly freshmen, 18, 19-year-old students. This is, I think, after they finish seeing this presentation, they're like, well, gosh, why haven't we done anything about this? And this is where we can come back again to the Dow Jones. So interestingly enough, if you compare the Dow Jones Industrial Average to temperature change, it's remarkably similar, right? And though I don't want to say like, okay, exact correlation, but there's been a number of studies looking at, GDP and CO2 emissions, for example. They're tightly coupled, and there's a good reason for that. And I think it also explains to some extent why it's so difficult to make progress. So like a lot of us are sort of pointing fingers at the oil and gas industry, and yes, they've been like very guilty perpetrators, much like the tobacco industry, that perjured themselves before Congress, right? It's a very similar phenomenon. But it's a much bigger problem than just the oil and gas industry. It's actually industry, period, because it takes carbon and energy to make anything. So when we point fingers at a particular group, it's actually maybe not quite seeing the whole picture. And so I just want to follow up with the most recent special report on climate change that the IPCC issued in October. And so this is where they were looking at what is it going to take, what are the effects of keeping temperatures at 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels versus 2 degrees C above industrial levels. And I think the most important take-home message there from that report is about the carbon budget. And I think it's useful to kind of go along with the financial model, thinking about the Dow Jones and thinking about budgeting, to look at what we need to do to keep temperatures at 1.5 degrees C, temperature rise. So we have to have net zero emissions by 2055. That's soon. That's, in our lifetime. We're not talking about 2100 anymore, right? We're talking about 2055. We have a remaining budget of 580 gigatons of CO2 that if we don't want to overshoot 1.5 degrees C, that's what we have left to spend. Currently, we're burning CO2 at a rate of 42 gigatons of CO2 per year. So who's good with the quick calculations? Yeah, so we have 14 years at our current rate. So 14 years to make a decision about what we're going to do. We don't even have that. We really need to make the decision now, right? But I think it brings home this message that we're not talking about what my colleague calls Coke Zero solutions, right? So Coke Zero is like, it tastes really good and it doesn't really cost you anything to drink it, right? It's like, yeah, it's good. No calories, does it have caffeine? No sugar? Caffeine, no sugar? Huh? Coke Zero? So the problem with Coke Zero, though, is that you don't actually get the thing. You don't get the Coke. So we don't have Coke Zero solutions here. We need serious solutions, and that's something that that I also practice with my students. So we go through a whole semester of talking about past climate variability, current change, how do we know these things? And then the end of the semester, they spend 2 weeks coming up with solutions. And that's perhaps the most interesting part of that particular class, is that they have to actually make some back-of-the-envelope calculations about what it would take to get to net zero. How much solar exactly does it take? And I think that's the real awakening, even for students who are on board with this, is the level of change that's required. And so we're not talking about small changes. And so that gets back to why it's been so difficult for us to take action. But I do want to leave on a positive note, and I do this with my class also. So I just would like to say that getting to net zero by 2055 seems really intimidating. But we should remember that any emissions reductions are good, because it's not just about 1.5. It's, we might miss 1.5. We might get to 2. We might get to 2.5. We might get to 5. But any reductions are going to be good. All solutions are on the table. And I think that's really important to consider, and taken me a while as sort of a rabid environmentalist, when I was 20, to get to the position now where I do believe that any solution is on the table. Also, challenges promote innovation, and I think this has been said already, and it's really important to recognize that. And certainly for this state in particular, these challenges could really provide some excellent opportunities for the state. And there's so much opportunity in change. Less opportunity in staying the same, but way more opportunity in change. So I'll just finish with that and answer any questions from the panel. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Amy. Brandi, I hope you got a PowerPoint you're going to use? Okay.
Yeah, I already put it up.
While she's doing that, I think Brandi was a student of Nick Zegg up here, weren't you? Yeah.
Still am.
Another cool lab, climate-conscious lab up here is run by a hydrology professor named Nicholas Zegg, who has sent a lot of folks out into the world teaching and researching and doing all sorts of other things, but he really gets climate in a good way. And Brandi has been working specifically on hydrology, and she's now teaching at Alderson Broaddus University down in Philippi. She's my neighbor in that area, and you presented at one of our conferences on the impacts of climate change in the Highlands and talked about your research there. I remember that, so I assume she's going to talk a little bit about that and also about her experiences now as a teacher dealing with the climate change topic.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for that introduction.
Yeah.
So before I start, I do want to clarify what I'm going to be talking about.
Get on the microphone a little bit more. Good.
Okay. So what I want to talk about is how to teach climate change in the classroom so that students can see the data on their own. Instead of telling students what's happening, I like the students to figure it out on their own. And I do this through a sort of new concept called active learning, where the students are actually engaging with the material instead of me showing them graphs and being like, carbon dioxide has increased a lot. I ask them, look at this graph. How much is climate change? How much is CO2 increasing? What's it doing? What do you think that means? Where does it come from? Talk to your group. Come up with some ideas. Come up with some solutions. And so a large portion of my class every day is me asking students, what do they think? Instead of me telling students what I think. And there's some caveats to this, so you can't get through as much material. But there's a lot of benefits in that students actually remember what they learn, and they like it because they're not bored. They're sitting in class and they're doing stuff, and I'll have one PowerPoint where I'm actually explaining some material because I do need to actually tell them stuff. And then I'll give them some time to work, so it's about every 5 to 7 minutes they're doing something. And this works because in these new generations, there's researchers that we have like a attention span literally less than a goldfish. So, and I see it. I actually see it, because if I go longer than 5 minutes, they're like, what's going on? I'm bored. So what I want to do today is not necessarily tell you that climate change is changing, that global warming is happening, but I want you to sort of interact with how our atmosphere works. What part of the atmosphere do you think is changing? And then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about it. And another thing I like to do in my classroom is have all different kind of technology. So students, I don't let them use their cell phones. I want them to use their hands to write, because research also shows that when they're writing as opposed to typing, they actually do learn more. Something about that kinesthetic movement sort of takes this like hot hand-eye coordination and actually puts it into their long-term memory. But I like videos, and I like movies, and I like clips. And so what I'm going to do today is show you some movies and some moving objects on my PowerPoint so that it can go into your visual memory and maybe sort of stay there for a little bit. And just use different ways to illustrate climate change instead of just graphs and tables and these things that my students absolutely won't remember in 8 seconds. Analogies, that's another thing. I use a lot of analogies, and students tend to like that. So now that I'm going to get started, do really start doing some research, please. If you're a faculty member, start thinking about this theory of active learning. It's actually implementing the material and having the students interact with the data. Okay, so the first thing, like I said, I talk about my PowerPoint, and then I allow students to interact. We have some papers that are going to be passed around. Can you girls go ahead and do that for me? Thank you so much. I realize that we don't have tables, so there will be questions that I'll have you interact with the material in a little bit. If you can't write on it, just get out your cell phone and type it. or if you have a computer, type it. When we get to this, know that it's a group thing. So talk to your neighbor and sort of talk about climate change with each other instead of using, I definitely want some communication and noise when we get to that. So we have 2 girls that'll be passing out papers, unless you've already gotten them. So I have to stay here, so my voice isn't very loud. So the first thing is we know that Earth is a greenhouse planet. As Amy said, or somebody said, we know that greenhouse gases are good. We know that they're great for our planet, but it's just really we're exacerbating this, and too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. And so our atmosphere is really very complex. And it's based on this this heat capture system through the greenhouse gases. And I sort of like to use it as an analogy from, as a car. So the thing that almost everybody in America probably has multiple is a car. Raise your hand if in this summer you ever opened the door and it was like heat just wafted out at you. So that's what our atmosphere is like. We have, in the analogy of a car, we have sunlight coming through our atmosphere, and then once it gets through our atmosphere, gets into Earth, it sort of changes. And once it goes back out into the atmosphere, it's stuck. And that's exactly what happens in a car. When light comes through our windshield, it sort of changes. Once it gets into our car, that new energy is stuck in our car. And that's why it gets so hot in our car, because once it gets through the windshield, it changes, and it can't escape again. So it gets so hot in our car. Same thing with our atmosphere. We have what's called shortwave radiation that comes from the sun, goes to our atmosphere, changes a little bit once it gets to Earth and reflects, and then our greenhouse gases absorb all of that heat and keep that energy and that heat in our atmosphere. And it makes Earth a wonderful place to live, obviously, if too much of a good thing doesn't become a bad thing. So knowing this, and knowing that that is a super simple explanation for something that I don't even know that scientists know the exact complexities of it. Atmosphere is extremely complex. Let's talk about actually what happens in the atmosphere. So this is what it looks like. Do you know, do we have like a laser pointer? Oh, okay. Great. Okay. So what I want to do now is I want to talk to you about actually how our atmosphere works and where these greenhouse gases are working. I'm not going to tell you where the greenhouse gases are working. I'm going to tell you how this works, and then I want you to think where the greenhouse gas is working, and this is where the teamwork thing is going to come in. So first we have the sun, which is the yellow. Can't really see it. The sun is yellow. 100% of our energy comes from the sun. Each of these numbers that we're seeing here is a percentage. Something really interesting about Earth that's a little bit different than some other planets is that we're an equal energy flux planet. So all of the energy that we get actually eventually will go back out into space. So all of these numbers add up to 100. You can see the exact inputs and outputs. So we have 100% of energy that comes from the sun. We have 23% right here that's absorbed by the atmosphere before it even gets to Earth. This is the kind of energy, for example, the ozone layer will absorb, and the UV rays that the ozone is protecting us from our very good friend, the ozone layer, among other things. And then we have 46% here that's absorbed by Earth. That's the heat that we can feel from Earth. Who's ever felt a rock in the sun in the summer, and it's pretty warm? Anybody felt a warm rock in the sun in the summer? Yeah, so that's 46% here that's absorbed by Earth. And then we have 25% here that's reflected from clouds. So that's before it even gets to Earth. Sunlight hits clouds, it's reflected up. Never even gets to Earth. And then we have this really important 6% right here that's reflected from the surface. And this is reflected from our snow. And white snow reflects more energy. And white snow does something that's really interesting in that it reflects energy. Who's ever had a white t-shirt on in the summer and noticeably felt that it's cooler than when you wear a black t-shirt? So it's the same with snow. So when we have our white t-shirt on, when we have white snow, energy is being reflected. And when that snow melts, it's starting to show that dark soil underneath, and that's absorbing more heat. And so over time, as our Arctic snow and other places starts to melt, this number might shift a little bit. But for now, this is how it is. It's a very important number and can contribute to climate change in a feedback system. So these numbers all add up to 100. We have 100% of energy from the sun. 23 is absorbed by the atmosphere from the ozone layer and other things before it even gets to Earth. 46% is absorbed by Earth, our hot rocks. 25 is reflected from the clouds, goes back into the atmosphere, never even hits Earth. And then 6% is reflected from white stuff. 23, 46, 25, 6 all add up to that 100, okay? So we have 100% here. All of that energy does something in these little arrows that come off of this big yellow arrow. Of this 46% that's absorbed by Earth, this part that's absorbed by Earth, the 46%, is that basically that heat in your car. So we have 46% that goes back out into these red arrows right here. 37 plus 9 equals 46. So 46 goes like this, and it's absorbed by the atmosphere, and it's emitted back out into space. These little red arrows are the heat in our car. They get to Earth, they're absorbed by Earth, they're reflected in a different energy that gets stuck in the atmosphere. So I'm going to go through that one more time. So one thing that I've noticed from teaching is that you think that it sounds pretty easy, but then my students are like, I have no idea what you just said. So I'm going to go through it one more time. We have 100% of energy from the sun. 23 is absorbed by the atmosphere. That's our ozone layer, other things. 46% is absorbed by Earth, our hot rocks in the sun. 25 is reflected from clouds before it even gets to Earth. 6% is reflected from white stuff. Of this 46% here, it goes into Earth and is reflected back out and gets stuck in our car. It's the hot air in our car. And then some can get stuck in our atmosphere, and some can just go right back out into space. It can make it through all of our clouds. It can make it through the 4 layers of our atmosphere, and it can just go straight back out into space and be like, see ya, bye. So now what I want you to do is use those numbers I just gave you. Talk to your group. If you're sitting by yourself, get up, please, and sit beside somebody else. This shouldn't be an individual thing. Meet some new people. And I want you to answer the questions on your sheet. Should be these. What are the energy inputs and outputs? Where does our energy come from? Where does it go? How does those numbers I just tell you add up to 100? So we know that 100% of our energy comes from the sun. How does where the energy go add back up to that 100%? You have 2 separate calculations here. You have your 100% from the arrow, and it's these 4. And then you have a separate set of the amount of energy that comes from the Earth and where that reflected energy from the Earth goes. So how does our energy inputs in the atmosphere add up to 100, right? And then once you've understood this schematic, so you need to start with something easy, right? Where does the energy come from? Where does it go? No numbers. And then how do these numbers add up? And then really start analyzing the schematic and think increasing the greenhouse gases affects what part of the schematic? So what part of this energy balance keeps the Earth warm? So we have this arrow, this arrow, this arrow, this arrow. So we have 6 arrows, right? Which one of these arrows are responsible for climate change? Yeah? That's because we didn't talk about that. That sort of goes, remember when I said that Earth is a really interesting planet in that we have equal flow of energy. We have the same amount of energy that comes into Earth, and then that amount of energy is reflected back into space, essentially. So all of these arrows that go back out into space, so you see how the arrows are like faded here, and then at some point they get dark. That's all of the energy that's essentially reflected back out into space. Eventually, you have 60 plus 9 plus 6 plus 25 will equal all of the amount of energy that's emitted back out into space. So for the purposes of this, please do just ignore just ignore this this part here that says emitted back, the 60%. Just ignore that for now. So for now, what I want you to do is I want you to analyze the part that I told you about. So 100% of energy is coming from the sun, 23% is absorbed by the atmosphere, and then you have these arrows. Talk to your group. I'm going to walk around, and I'm going to talk to people and see if you're on the right track. I don't have much time, no. So this might go fast.
5 minutes.
You have 5 minutes to do this.
5 minutes. So I never.
Okay, that's fine. I'm done. All right, so that's all the time we have. Know that when it comes to something this complex, I leave about 20 minutes in my class for the students to work through this. And I have a small class size. I only have 15 to 30 people in my class, so I can walk around and I can talk to everybody. So know that having 5 minutes isn't enough. But eventually, these students can really start to interact with this material and understand how the atmosphere works, is on a very specific level, understand where greenhouse gases are affecting our atmosphere. And so to answer your last question, what I really want my students to get to is to understand that greenhouse gases are impacting the percentage of energy that is absorbed by our atmosphere. It's our greenhouse gases, and it's absorbing more of the energy in our atmosphere, and it's keeping our globe warmer. That's all I have, but if you are a faculty member and you present to your classroom, do keep in mind that you can just have them teach themselves. And it really makes it easier for you on this end, because then you're not talking for 50 minutes. If there are questions, we have to answer them later. But it was wonderful talking to you. And sorry I went so long.
That was fabulous. Thank you, Brandi. Okay, she's putting up a hashtag for the National Energy Conference while I'm doing this. I'll just say I got my questions, pass them in. I've already got 3 up here so far. I'm going to ask them. Perry, you got what you go in writing? Okay, hold on. Let me get with these compliant people here. Try to honor their compliance. Thank you. A couple more. By the way, I've alluded several times to the fact that Friends of Blackwater and our Climate Change and Impacts Initiative has been doing these kitchen climate science programs that we've created 3-dimensional models using colored rice grains and tennis balls, and they're all out in the hall there, and there's a teacher's manual, actually, which goes on forever, but it does contain the basics of how you can show a lot of this stuff in 3 dimensions, and nothing like being a photon and traveling from the sun to the earth and back and getting trapped by the greenhouse gases. I mean, this is some fun stuff, and kids like to do it in classrooms. So when I read this stuff, I say, we need to get up, and then when we get them to dance the greenhouse boogie, that's the best. All right. Here's a question. First question. Any thoughts on how West Virginia residents can impact their boards of education, county boards, to improve their climate change curricula? Any experience? You might have a good insight on that.
Well, my brother-in-law just recently ran and was elected to my local board of education.
Speak up a little.
I think that's challenging. Probably working through. Amy just mentioned that they're in our recently adopted 2016 curriculum, we now have a 9th grade Earth and Space Science course. That's required of all high school students. Unfortunately, we're a little slower to respond to needs at the higher education level in terms of providing adequate training and depth of content that they would have needed in their college curriculum. And so Fairmont State, WVU, and Marshall, we're trying to put forth an Earth and Space Science certification. But unfortunately, not all of the teachers that are teaching this course have had a real depth experience or maybe even any class in meteorology or climatology prior to teaching this course now. And so working with those teachers, reaching out to those teachers who I think teachers recognize their own deficiencies in understanding, and oftentimes that translates into avoidance, right? They just sort of avoid the topic or assign students to read the chapter, and you know how well that goes. And so really reaching out, working first with your local educators is how I highly recommend in terms of impacting your local level. The school board is another matter and outside of my wheelhouse.
All right, I want to just add to that. There are several climate groups in West Virginia that are now doing programs in schools in cooperation with their local school board, climate education using citizen volunteers. And, you know, sometimes you get some pushback, but sometimes it's quite successful. In Parkersburg, they've been doing it a bunch. The next question here, Amy, we got a quick question. Is that C13 or 14C that is depleted due to radioactive decay? I had to ask that question. I have no idea what it means.
So, yeah, so the old carbon has, you know, fossil fuel carbon's really old, right? So it's had a longer time period to decay, so it tends to be lighter isotopically. So, yeah.
That's
so the stuff that's like moving around in the atmosphere all the time is younger, right? So it's heavier. So that's why we see that change.
Yeah. So this carbon that I've accumulated in me since 310, when my cohort, is that old carbon or new carbon?
That would be new.
All right.
Newer,
New carbon. Yeah. But
yeah,
I picked
so
up some.
You have that.
I probably have
on.
some of that old carbon in me. Is what you're saying? No.
I mean, I probably do.
Yeah. You. Okay. Amy, did you ever discuss geoengineering with your students? And you as a meteorologist also might.
Oh, yeah, that's a really great question. So geoengineering is something that I've always like sort of recoiled from, right? But I do have this policy in my class and for myself that that all options are on the table. So I think, you know, it's really important for students
Why don't you just say what geoengineering is?
So,
some people don't know it.
Yeah, I'm sure there's somebody else who's better at explaining what that is than me. But yeah, these are like engineered solutions to climate change. So it could be like, how can we break down CO2 into carbon monoxide and oxygen, or how can we sort of vacuum up, you know, the CO2 that's in the atmosphere, things like that. So yeah, seeding, yeah.
So again, that immediately draws to mind our recently adopted next generation science standards now require our teachers to implement and incorporate engineering into their instruction at every grade level in science. So they have engineering expectations, which was brand new, right? I mean, it came, for those of us in the science world, felt like it came out of like, what? But so that means, again, our teachers are underprepared in terms of presenting that to their students, understanding it themselves. So that, again, is another avenue of reach that you can sort of reach out to your teachers in terms of, you know, I can help you with those engineering and technology standards that now are part of your curriculum that they've probably had very little prior expertise and experience incorporated in their instruction. So it's another sort of avenue of entry into working and collaborating with your local educators.
Yeah, we're going to hear from some engineers this afternoon, actually, who are working on reducing methane emissions here this afternoon from WVU. And let's see, Perry. I'm going to call him Perry. He has his hand up here.
Could you talk a little bit about the carbon cycle and why the carbon we put in the atmosphere today will be around for hundreds, if not thousands of years?
Yeah, I mean, or Tina might be a better person to answer that.
Oh, golly geez.
Yeah, I mean, it's a slow process, right? So the carbon cycle, the active carbon cycle is pretty slow. So unlike the chemicals that break down the ozone layer that we've been pretty effective at dealing with, it's going to take a lot longer for CO2 to be sort of taken up, absorbed by the oceans, for example. So yeah, it's a longer term, hundreds of years at a minimum.
Somebody, this person here. Speak up.
Dr. Hessl, I agree with you mostly, but the 1970s were a time of wrenching change. When you go out to your car, the shape of your car is based on the technologies that developed in the 70s due to the OPEC embargo. The engine you have is optimized based on that, and the distance to the ground, all these things. My point is that we went through wrenching change, we improved, and then we backslid, essentially. And that's relevant. If we're making these changes by 2055, we have to remember the 70s, whether we want to or not.
So So what's your, I don't totally understand what the case you're making is.
Engines got more efficient, cars changed shape.
Yeah.
Speed limits were 55.
Right. No, I remember it being in line for gas, as a kid.
Well,
So.
I'll just give you a personal example.
Yeah.
My father started riding a bicycle on a dangerous road. I've been bicycling my whole life based on his example, and also being a kid. But I now ride a bicycle everywhere I can. I'm an ambassador for cycling, bicycling, because of the 70s. And I don't think I can be who I am without the 70s. So that was my life.
Well, there's some people here who just gleam in somebody's eye in the 70s. Yeah.
Yeah, no, so I don't know, my view of this is that we've made minimal, we've really made minimal efforts to deal with this problem so far.
I want to follow up on something several people have said here about this question here. Said, I just met science teachers at the West Virginia Science Teachers Association, and they said that a number of people had said they were really afraid still to talk about climate change in their classroom. And so, if you got any advice for those teachers, or any thoughts about that, about how people deal with that, because it's real for lots of reasons, and it's not something to put down. It has to be addressed, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. The number of people, even in a large lecture class of like 350, when I first started teaching in 2001, I would occasionally get someone who would just really heckle me, but that's pretty much gone away. So I can't speak to what it's like in the K through 12. I think it might be a little harder, but I'm a scientist, so I just always go back to the data, and I encourage them to bring their own data to the table. So, but that's,
Any thoughts, Brandi? You're teaching Alderson, Broaddus. You're seeing undergraduates, pretty young people just out of high school. For some people, is this? Do you feel a little concerned, like maybe I might offend somebody here, or am I?
Well, I teach climate change to non-majors, to elementary eds actually, and I was just telling somebody I just actually gave a climate change lecture to that class this weekend, and I always ask them at some point, "What do you believe in climate change?" And they all said yes. It's this pretty small class, but it's like they all said yes. But then I said, "Well, do you know somebody that doesn't believe in climate change?" And 2 or 3 people said they did, and it was very interesting, though, because they told me in the context that they have arguments with these people about climate change, like it's happening, and so they're constantly engaging with, they're usually family members, they're engaging with their family members about climate change and arguing that it's an important issue. And I sort of followed up with that, and I said to all of your elementary ed majors, this is a really important topic, and you need to understand it so that you can inform this new generation, because this is an intergenerational problem, and we're going to be the problem solvers. My generation will probably be the problem solvers, and then they're teaching another generation of problem solvers. And so my hope is that I can teach them so that they believe it, like Amy said, to their core enough that they're like, kind of like, I'm a scientist and I don't care if I offend people, because this is a problem and I want to tell everybody about it. And they seem to be. Thank you.
Brandi, let me follow up on that for just a second, because we're going to have to head for the lunchroom. I want to say that having been in front of quite a few hundred students, high school students, talking about, not in science clubs, in the HISTA clubs, the thing I thought I developed spontaneously, and now it's part of my repertoire. Well, one, I play the banjo. They tend to like that, and that's helpful. So if you see me with a banjo at lunchtime, watch out. And 2, I apologize. As an old guy, I can do that maybe more credibly. But I frankly think that, we blew it. My generation and the folks, us folks, when we bracket 310, when I was born, and the people in front of us, Who knew? I mean, it was inadvertent, but we created a real mess. And it's not their fault that we've created this mess. And I think that when they, I don't like to hear arrogant science. Why don't you follow science? Because it's difficult. Because who knew? There are downsides to science, and when scientists acknowledge those, I mean, scientists created the nuclear bomb as well as nuclear energy. And so when apologies go a long way to opening people's hearts to understanding, in my opinion, for young people anyhow, and for a lot of ignorant older people who didn't realize what the heck we've been doing for a while. So I offer that advice that leading with an apology it can be very helpful. Are we ready to go, Jamie? You want to say anything to everybody?
Yeah. Lunch is going to be down the hall in the major event space, event hall. We're going to have 2 buffet lines. There's a line in the lobby, and then there's also a line in the event hall space. So grab your food, and then we've got tables for 225 people or so. And then we're going to hear from Emily for as soon as half hour we go for lunch, we're going to do panel.
So even if you didn't sign up for lunch, there's lunch for you, right? Absolutely. Very good. Thank you. Thanks to this panel. Thanks to this audience.